It's our Injury Expert Spectacular episode. And who better to have on than ESPN's Stephania Bell? Beat the Shift is next. Welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast. I am your host, Ariel Cohen, and with me as always, Ruvain Guy. How are you, Ruvain?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Well, tonight is our injury episode. I know, Ruvain, we know that you're an orthopedic PA on the show, but tonight we've got a special injury guest. You might already know her from ESPN, the one and only Stephania Bell. Welcome to the show, Stephania.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. You know, just a little bit about you. Like, how did you get into fantasy and into injury reporting and all that?
Well, I'll try and keep it to the Reader's Digest version. But basically, I'm a physical therapist. I still keep my license. I still participate in conferences and meetings, although I'm working for ESPN full time, so I'm not seeing patients anymore. But I've always worked in orthopedics and sports, and I've played fantasy football for several years before I transitioned from working as a PT to ESPN. And essentially, it became very clear to me that injuries were key to success in fantasy sports. And the one thing people in my league were always asking me about was injuries. And I realized that information on injuries could give you an edge. And not just knowing, like sourcing specific information on a player, but just understanding the nature of the injury, typically how an athlete recovers from it, what might be lingering effects after an injury, things of that nature. So, once I got the idea, it was a matter of trying to lobby to various fantasy entities to see if I could generate some interest, and started with a couple small outfits, but RotoWire picked me up pretty quickly. And really, I give them a lot of credit because it's the space they gave me to write and then to do their radio show. They were one of the first to partner with SiriusXM Radio. And that got me the practice of being on the air. And I had gotten to know Matthew Berry through, it was FSTA at that time, through going to the meetings. And when he went to ESPN and was building a fantasy team, he thought I had a unique combination. There were hardly any women really doing fantasy sports as a profession, and I had this unique background looking at injuries. So they took a chance on me at ESPN. I will be forever grateful for that, because here I am now 13 years later. Yeah,
well, that worked out really well. Definitely a different level, but it reminds me of me and my partner Ruvain here, who we partner in fantasy leagues together. He's the injury guy, and I agree with you 13,000% that injuries are one way to extract value. I mean, so many questions about a player. Is the player right? I mean, we know there's a true skill level, but do we know if he's there because of injury? And if we had more information and we had a better sense, that's a huge edge in playing the game. Wanted to start with Tommy John surgery in general. Could you just lay down the timeline for it, and not just how long until a pitcher actually gets on the mound, but more importantly, how long until he gets back to his prior skill level?
Well, this is a great question, and there's a wide range of outcomes, just like there are for most injuries. And I think people in our audience who have heard me talk about things like this at ESPN will always say, it's a range. It depends on the athlete, depends on his unique history, etc. But given that, we know that now we're seeing on average 14 to 16 month return from Tommy John surgery, return to competitive action, consistent competitive action. And for a while there, it was getting pushed faster and faster, like many things often do. How quickly can we get someone back? We saw guys coming back about 12 months. And I think the grand experiment of that, people felt like maybe it was a little too quick. Saw a rash of guys having secondary injuries after they returned. And so I think the consensus in the sports medicine world is there's really not a reason to push it by a couple of months, especially if it means that you're going to have not only potentially a better outcome from a health perspective, but maybe the guys are going to come back and be able to perform a little bit better sooner. Now, that said, a lot of guys will tell you that they don't really feel like themselves until they've been pitching for a while. And seasonal calendar is something we talk about in sports in terms of when guys are returning. So that matters, because if a pitcher is coming back at the start of the baseball season, coming off Tommy John, and their calendar for recovery has them working into the rotation early in the season, their chance of looking more like their pre-injury self is better by the latter part of that season than somebody who would come back mid-season. But most guys will say it takes them throwing and for a year before they really start to feel like they're throwing like they used to. And the metrics support that. We see a lot of up and down. It's not necessarily a linear relationship. Guys can come back and look fantastic out of the gate. And then a month or two in, sometimes they'll struggle and go backwards a little bit and then come back and perform better later. But there seems to be a feeling out period of getting used to their new arm. And I remember talking to Adam Wainwright one year at spring training, and he said that when he first started, it felt like it wasn't really his arm. And guys will say this, like they feel a little detached from this arm because it's new and they have never taken this much time off throwing until they have this type of injury and they have this lengthy recovery. And they have to relearn the motor pattern and they have to get used to the feeling of this new graft in their elbow. So that takes some time.
Yeah. And would you say that it's not just the time, it's also the competitive play more? I mean, you mentioned a little bit in your answer there, but how big a deal is it getting the work in rather than just coming solid the following year and coming right back?
Oh, you can't replicate game conditions outside of game conditions. So It's important for them to have competition. We say this with any injury. The final phase of rehab is actually when you return to competition. And even in baseball, they could return to competition, but as you know, competition at the minor league level or, when they're on assignment, for example, if they're working their way to come back up, it's not the same. It doesn't generate the same adrenaline. It's not the same feeling, and it's not the same level of competition. So until they're actually able to engage in that, they're really not return to pre-injury level in terms of the work that they're required to do. And then to be able to perform consistently at that level, that takes additional time.
Right. Ruven, anything to add to that general analysis?
Yeah, I think she nailed it pretty well. There are a couple of things I want to give some actual support for what Stephania just said. Everyone always thinks Tommy John is 10 to 12 months, everything out for a year, and that's it. But that is completely incorrect because starting from February 1st, 2018 until today, there have been 250 major league pitchers, or from single A to major leagues, who had Tommy John surgery. The average recovery time is about 16 months. I'm going to give you some examples of how long some pitchers took. Johnny Cueto, Brent Suter, Anthony Banda, 13 months. Carlos Rodon, Dinelson Lamet, 14 months. Jordan Montgomery, A.J. Puck, 15 months. Corey Knebel, Michael Fulmer, Drew Smith, 16 months. Dane Dunning, Taijuan Walker, Chad Kuhl, 17 months. So everyone is basically on their own schedule. You can't say, okay, this person is scheduled for Tommy John surgery. He's going to be out at a certain period of time, and that's it. There's no one set rule. And now there's actually a relatively new procedure called an internal brace, which is something that Rhys Hoskins had recently. It's been going on for a couple of years. Rich Hill had it done. He was only out for 10 months. Jesse Hahn had it. He was out for 13 months. Danny Santana had it in September of last year, and Rhys Hoskins had it in October of last year. And they're saying that Rhys Hoskins is on schedule to be able to play when the season starts. But that would be extremely quick. That's talking about 8 months, and that's very, very hard to do. Yes, it's possible for someone who had regular Tommy John surgery to come back in 8 months, but they're not going to be themselves. Just look at Aaron Hicks. He actually said he had surgery, and he said that he never felt the same through the year when he came back. You need the repetition. You need to have the major league playing to get your body going and see exactly what you have after the surgery.
Actually, I want to talk about that internal brace a little bit. I'm glad you brought it up. It was a friend of mine who pioneered that, Dr. Jeff Dugas down in Birmingham, Alabama. I remember when he had he called him patient 0. And he was telling me, I think I'm onto something, but we're going to have to wait and see. And it was a long time before it ever made its way to any professional athletes. And part of that is because it has to be the right candidate. That's a really critical component of who gets selected for a UCL repair. Essentially, it's a repair of the ligament tear as opposed to a reconstruction where you bring in a graft. So they're repairing the ligament back down to the bone, which means that it typically is really only suited for guys who tear at one end of the ligament. Essentially, the ligament avulses or pulls off the end of the bone, as opposed to what we see with a lot of guys who are more senior in terms of their elbow history, who have degenerative ligament. The ligaments become frayed and damaged over time, tears in the middle, and that's not going to be amenable to repair. But these pops where the ligament itself is healthy, but it has pulled away from the bone, they're able to anchor it back down and then reinforce it with the synthetic tape, which is what constitutes the internal brace. And, really the first guys that he tried it on were guys who they were young, high school or college age pitchers who were maybe trying to get through their last year of eligibility. If they didn't have it repaired, they were not going to be able to finish out their final year. In other words, they weren't looking at future prospects in baseball. They were just trying to have that last season. So they were good first candidates because if the repair failed, they ultimately wouldn't have been any worse off than they would have been already. And after they saw a pattern of success with, again, choosing the right candidate and doing the procedure, it started, word starts getting out as it does. And there were some pros who became good candidates for this. And Rich Hill, as you mentioned, was one. And Rich Hill was really the first professional pitcher to have this and return to his prior level of competition, meaning he would return to pitch in the majors. Now, the thing about Rhys Hoskins is he's a first baseman. So although it sounds quick, it's actually less demand for him than as a pitcher. And it's actually well within the timeline for this. And they've actually found that the thing they have to watch with these guys is holding them back because they feel so good. And if you imagine, you're not harvesting a graft. It's a lot less complicated than a reconstruction. The recovery is much smoother. So I think he's going to be a really interesting one to watch. And you will see this procedure come about more, but it's important to explain all this because people, you can see people saying, oh, well, this is going to be great. Just replace Tommy John, but it's really not meant for that. It really has to fit with the right candidate.
Wow. This is something I've never heard before, and so glad, and you've heard it first here on the Beat the Shift podcast, everyone. When they have this kind of surgery, is this something that's known to the public very easily? Because I just hear,
no.
Right? Okay.
Because actually, when I was doing my prep for the season, if you look, it's widely reported that Rhys Hoskins had Tommy John.
Right.
And you have to, I will give credit to Jim Salisbury of NBC Sports, who actually reported this and talked about, Steve Cohen, the team doc for the Phillies, who did the internal brace repair. And I actually know some folks who are doing it, but again, not every surgeon is doing it because not every surgeon is comfortable. They usually have consultation. They're talking about making sure that it's the right candidate. And the conversation with the athlete going in is, look, you look like the right candidate for this. And they explain to them, what we just talked about and why they would opt to do it. But they say,